My name is Matt. So glad you could join us as we continue the Acts of the Jewish Apostles, which we started in 22, and we're continuing in 2023. Today, we're going to cover only 5 verses in the start of Acts chapter 16, in a message called The Jewish Paul Problem. See, Paul, more than any other New Testament person, is blamed for inconsistency and hypocrisy by both Jewish and Christian scholars. Paul has been slandered as one who started a new religion and made the Torah obsolete. Paul is separated from the Jewish people and made into a Christian who hates the Torah and the practice of Judaism. Much of what Paul dealt with in his life and also in all the years that have followed is like Stephen, who he stoned for the accusations of being against Moses and against God and against the temple and against the Torah. So Paul has been blamed for the same things. The charges that he is against Moses, against the temple, against the Torah, against Jewish practice for Jewish people. And none of these things are true. Interestingly, Peter said about Paul in a letter to Jewish believers in 2 Peter chapter 3, he says, "Bear in mind that the patience of our Lord means salvation, just as our dearly loved brother Paul also wrote to you in the wisdom given to him. He speaks of these matters in all of his letters. Some things in them are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable, as they do with the rest of the scriptures, due to their own destruction." Interesting that Peter refers to Paul's letters as scripture before they become officially scripture. But he says they twist his words as they twist the rest of the scriptures. And because of that, both Jewish and Christian history, both Jewish and Christian leaders, both the rabbis and what we call the church fathers, twisted Paul's words a very long time ago, and the twisting of his words has continued through today. To this day, Paul is charged more than any other by both the rabbis of Judaism and the church fathers of Christianity as being against God, against Moses, against the temple, and against the Torah. The idea is he created a new religion, and we'll come back to that in Acts 21 in several weeks when we get there, and he's accused of it even more specifically. I wrote a book during COVID called Jesus Never Said Anything New, and one of my ideas is a follow-up book called Paul Never Said Anything New. Because like Yeshua, Paul's context was in a Jewish world that's informed by by first century Jewish practice. Paul did not create a new religion. Paul did not preach against the Torah. Paul applied the Torah to Gentiles, as every form of Judaism, as we've talked about in previous sermons, especially through Acts 15, was attempting to do in the first century. The truth is, Paul is Jewish, and his context is Jewish, and unfortunately, that's a problem for many people in the non-Messianic Jewish world and for many people in the Christian world. Because for 1900 years, he's been preached as one who is against Jewish practice for Jewish people. I think about how frustrated Paul would be to know that people were using his words to make him sound like he was against Moses and against God, against the Torah and the temple and the practice of Judaism for Jewish people. It happens sometimes when I preach or when anyone communicates that we hope to find a clear way to communicate something and we work hard to communicate it clearly, but what we communicate is not as clear as we hope, and people walk away with believing that you said the opposite of what you actually just said. I can imagine how frustrated Paul would be to know that what Peter said of him 2,000 years ago is still true today, and that he is accused still for 1900 years of being against all the things that he loved and gave his life for: the preaching of the gospel, preaching of the Torah, the preaching of Yeshua, who is the living word. One Jewish example is Rabbi Joseph Telushkin in his book Jewish Literacy. He says, Paul radically redefined the small Jewish sect into a new religion that sharply broke with Judaism. According to him, Paul, what mattered to God was not the observance of Torah, but faith in Jesus. And those surviving Christians who had known Jesus personally, which Paul had not, it's like a little shot at Paul, strenuously resisted this teaching. In other words, what he's saying is James and Peter, John, even Jesus himself, they were all good Jews who kept the Torah. But Paul, and they all disagreed with Paul because Paul is a problem. Paul's even more of a problem if you actually put him back in his context instead of what he's accused of being, which is Paul the convert, Paul the used to be Jewish, Paul the former Pharisee, Paul the former Jew. The truth is, Paul came to believe what he stoned Stephen for believing. And just like Stephen was accused of being against the Torah, God, and the temple and the Torah, Paul, and like Stephen, was never against Moses, God, the temple, and the Torah. He was for all of these things as a Jewish man and rabbi. Not too long after the apostles, which the last apostle to die is John in the year 95, in the 100s, just a few years later, there is a group that we called the Church Fathers, leaders of Christianity before there were any splits in what became Christianity later. And what we find is many of them, these church fathers, did not necessarily have a hatred for Jewish people, like anti-Semitism. That comes much later. But these church fathers were against the practice of Judaism. You could say they were anti-Judaism. It was not Paul who was against Judaism and the Torah for Jewish people. It was the church fathers who took his words and made him against the things, twisted his words, like Peter said, and made him against these things. In the 100s CE, and what would soon become Christianity, you first see the writings of the church father Ignatius in 120. And he's really the first to contrast Christianity with Judaism. He made Christianity good and Judaism bad in his writings. And there's many Christian writings of church fathers between the years 100 and 190 that create this foundation for what we know as replacement theology today. Justin Martyr, a church father, wrote a document called The Dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, in the year 160. And he creates the idea, using the words of Paul, that Christ is the new law, replacing the old law, and that Christians are the new Israel, and that Jews are the old Israel. Another church father named Melito of Sardis on the Pascha in 170 creates the idea that the Jews killed Christ and now lie dead themselves. Around the same time that these church fathers are becoming anti-Judaism, the rabbis, the descendants of the Pharisees in the 100s, reject the Jewish followers of Jesus and even create a story in the 100s. That Jesus was not the product of a virgin birth through the Holy Spirit and his mother Miriam, but rather he was a product of an adulterous union with a Roman soldier named Pantera. And Jesus is referred to in the Tosefta as Yeshu ben Pantera. Yeshu is not the same name as Yeshua. Yeshu means may his name be blotted out. And Ben Pantera is son of this Roman soldier named Pantera. Shai Cohen, the Jewish historian, says this. He says, by the 2nd century CE, that's the 100s, these Jewish Christians did not fit anywhere. I mean, in my experience, in the modern world, growing up in Messianic Judaism and being a part of it my whole life, I've never fit anywhere. As a father of children who have grown up in Messianic Judaism, I find this is often true for my kids as well. We don't fit the boxes. We don't fit the categories. We don't fit the narratives of modern Judaism or modern Christianity. And so we must be a cult. We must be out of our minds. We must be making things up. But the truth is, and this is the danger for anyone involved in Messianic Judaism, is we have to be careful not to be bitter towards the rabbis and not to be bitter towards the church fathers. Because, well, they're all our fathers in terms of faith. We just have to know who we are and what God has called us to do in this generation. By the 300s, Judaism has nothing to do with Jewish followers of Yeshua. And Christianity has nothing to do with Jewish followers of Yeshua either. in the year 380 in Antioch, the city where the gospel was first preached by Paul to the Gentiles. Gentile Christians were visiting synagogues to learn from the Jewish people about the Torah and about God. And John Chrysostom, a church father, preached 8 sermons against these believers for visiting Jewish people and learning about Judaism, which he said was done away with. Jerome in the 300s said this specifically regarding Jewish followers of Jesus. They are not Jews because they believe in Christ, and they are not Christian because they observe the Jewish laws. What does that make every original follower of Yeshua? What does that make Yeshua himself? This idea, which is still prevalent to this day, is nowhere in the Bible. It's not in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures. It's not in the New Testament. And it leads to some of the most frustrating questions that are asked by non-Messianic Jewish people and by Gentile Christians. Chief of which is to Messianic Jews like myself, how can you follow Torah and Jesus? Do you mean like Jesus did? Like Peter, Jacob, and Paul? Like all the original followers of Yeshua did? And other questions similar to this, like, well, didn't Jesus do away with the Torah? No. Didn't Paul do away with Jewish practice? No, not for Jews. Then what do you do with Galatians? Well-meaning Christians ask me often. And of course, my first answer is, I read it. Doesn't Paul's letter to the Galatians do away with Torah practice for Jewish people? No. The letter of Galatians is to Gentiles, explaining what Gentiles ought to do and not do. This is part of the Jewish problem, the Jewish Paul problem. See, it's easier at this point in history for both sides, Judaism and Christianity, to distance themselves from each other because they've been doing it since the 100s. That's 1900 years. But it doesn't mean it was right. And again, the point is not, which I've seen far too often, and I've experienced myself over the course of my life, a bitterness towards the rabbis and bitterness towards the church fathers. Look, we could be frustrated by how history has twisted these things, but the goal is to understand the history and compare it to what the text actually says. And this I know for sure. The confusion is not Paul's fault. The confusion comes from exactly what Peter warned people regarding Paul's writings. And the circumcision of Timothy in Acts chapter 16, the first 5 verses, the very first thing that is after the Jerusalem Council, which we just did 3 messages on, Acts 15. What do we do with Gentiles? Tells the story of how much Paul loved the Torah and the observance of Judaism for Jewish people. Acts 16 of verse 1, it says, "Now Paul came to Derbe and Lystra, and there was a disciple there named Timothy. He was son of a woman who was Jewish and a Jewish believer and a Greek father who was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And as they were traveling through the cities, they were handing down the rulings that had been decided upon by the emissaries and the elders in Jerusalem for them to keep. As they were traveling, they were handing down the rulings of what Gentiles must do. The 4 things that add up to 100 different commandments, as we talked about in the last 3 sermons. They were handing those things down from the apostles in Jerusalem, everywhere the gospel was being preached to Gentiles. And the places that Paul visited in Acts 13 and 14, including the city of Antioch, where the question was, how can Gentiles join the family of God? They answer and travel with an answer from the apostles in Jerusalem. And as Paul traveled, now with Silas, not Barnabas, they came back to Derbe and Lystra. And my mom keeps saying I have to say Lystra. But I'm just going to keep saying Lystra because I'm a grown man. Remember, Lystra is the first place that the gospel is preached to Greek-speaking Gentiles. We talked about it in a message in Acts 14. Remember, it's when Paul and Barnabas were called Hermes and Zeus because they healed a man who couldn't walk. And apparently there's this disciple named Timothy who was there, a Jewish believer in the city who came to know Yeshua. I would guess that he came to faith in Yeshua along with his mother and grandmother through the preaching of Paul. But there weren't many people in the cities of Derbe and Lystra who were Jewish. And so Paul says he was well spoken of his brothers, but there's a problem. This Jewish man with a Greek father, because he had a Greek father, was not circumcised. And so Paul specifically takes him to be circumcised because he was not circumcised on the 8th day, as Jewish people are supposed to be according to the Torah. So back to verse 3, it says, "So Paul wanted this man to accompany him, Timothy. And he took him and circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people in those places. For they all knew that his father was a Greek." Now, part of the issue here is in most English translations, instead of the Jewish people, the phrase is the Jews. It happens here in the book of Acts. It also happens all through the Gospel of John. And it's a translation of the English. That's the problem. The Jews is never what it says in Greek. What it says in Greek is Judeans. And we remember that there are two groups of Jewish people. There are Judeans who speak Hebrew and Aramaic from the region of Judea. And then there are Greek-speaking Jews all over the Jewish world, all over the Greek world. And in this part of the Greek world, up in the region of Galatia, there were Judeans, meaning they were people, Jewish people, who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. And the phrase, "for the sake of the Jews" in these places has made it that these Jews were the only reason that Paul had this goal of evangelism. And because of his goal of evangelism, he had to circumcise Timothy to make it easier for Jewish people to accept him. But here, if you read the Jews as Judeans, it becomes a very specific group who were opposed to the Hellenist Jews who only spoke Greek. And there were some Jewish people, Hebrew-speaking, from Judea who were in the city of Lystra and Derbe, and perhaps those people were the Judeans that he's talking about, were most likely, could be, the ones who started the controversy in the first place in Antioch. It's funny, just a few weeks ago, controversially, a bit of a, as they say in England, a controversy, Dave Chappelle in his monologue in SNL said this. He said, "Early in my career, I learned that there are two words in the English language which should never say together in sequence, and those are the words the and Jews. Because I've never heard someone do good after they say that." And that's been happening for a long time, rooted in a misunderstanding of the scriptures. So in Acts 16 and verse 3, again, it says, "Paul wanted this man to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people in those places, for they all knew his father was a Greek." Now, most commentators take the words, "he took him and circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people," and make Timothy's circumcision an issue of evangelism. He had to circumcise him so Jewish people would listen to him. The issue in Antioch was whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised at all. And there's no question in the New Testament, ever, as to whether Jewish people should continue to circumcise. And there's no prohibition against Jewish people continuing to circumcise our sons in the New Testament. The issue of circumcision in all of Paul's writings, and even in the book of Acts, is connected to what Gentiles should do. And the ruling was made that Gentiles are not supposed to be circumcised, nor were they ever commanded to be circumcised. But still, Christian commentators like N.T. Wright say this. So Paul circumcised Timothy, not, I stress, because Timothy needed circumcision to become a full member of God's people, but because it was going to be much easier to advance Paul's mission if his companions were all able to be seen as proper Jews. Yes, it would be easier if Timothy was circumcised for the Jewish people, especially these Judeans who needed him to be circumcised. But Paul did not only have Timothy circumcised because of those Judeans. The reason why Paul had Timothy circumcised is because Timothy is Jewish and not circumcised. When N.T. Wright says, not because Timothy needed circumcision to become full members of God's people, Well, he's right. Circumcision doesn't make us full members of God's people. We don't need to be circumcised to become full members of God's people. That happens in the time of the Maccabees. But that is not why we circumcise our sons. That's a first century problem. The idea of circumcision is that circumcision is a sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham and God commanded Abraham's descendants to circumcise our sons as a sign that he would give us the land of Israel, the descendants of Abraham. A Jewish man does need to be circumcised, to be faithful to what God has commanded us to be. It's a part of what it means to be a people separated from the nations for God. Paul did not only circumcise Timothy just to make it easier to share the gospel. He did it because it's the right thing for Jewish men to do who are not circumcised. God commanded it, not men. The flip side is Titus. Titus is another disciple of Paul who, like Timothy, he refers to as a son, and he talks about him in Galatians chapter 2. He says, "Yet not even Titus, who was with me, a Greek, was forced to be circumcised." This issue came up because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out freedom in Messiah in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not give in to them for a moment so that the truth of the good news might be preserved for you. Interesting. Two different men that Paul calls sons, the opposite conclusion. Timothy is in Acts 16 and verse 3. It says that Paul wanted this man to accompany him and took him and circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people in those places. But his other son, Titus, in Galatians 2 and verse 3, it says, "Yet not even Titus who was with me, a Greek, was forced to be circumcised." What's the difference between Timothy and Titus? One is Jewish, the other is not. One is taken by Paul to be circumcised, Timothy, who's Jewish, and the other, Paul celebrates that he was not circumcised or deceived into being circumcised because he's not Jewish. Later, Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 17. He says, "Listen, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, let him walk in this way. I give this rule in all of Messiah's communities. Was anyone called when he already had been circumcised? Let him not make himself uncircumcised. Has anyone been called while uncircumcised? Let him not allow himself to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping God's commandments matters. So let each one remain in the calling in which he is called." Well, Timothy was uncircumcised, but Paul takes him to be circumcised because he had him circumcised because he's Jewish and he wasn't circumcised. So when you read the words in 1 Corinthians 7, he's using circumcision as Jewish and uncircumcision as Gentile. He does the same thing in the verses right before when he talks about male and female and marriage, and the verses right after when he talks about slave and free. So why does he say circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing? Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping God's commands is what counts. Well, keeping God's commandments means you do what God commands. And Jewish people are commanded to be circumcised. And Gentiles are commanded not to be circumcised. Well, physical circumcision, as we talked about in Acts 15, means nothing without the circumcision of the heart, both for Jews and Gentiles. Moses said that, and Paul agrees with Moses. As Jewish people, we keep God's commands when we circumcise our sons on the 8th day. And even today, if a Jewish man is not circumcised, as we're supposed to be on the 8th day, I would encourage them to be circumcised because God commanded us to be circumcised. Gentiles keep God's command when they are not circumcised. and they do not circumcise their sons because they were never commanded to do so. It has nothing to do with the physical circumcision for health and doctors and all of that, but the ceremony of circumcision that brings us into the covenant of Abraham as a sign of the covenant. But Paul doesn't seem to take his own advice then. If he's saying, has anyone been called while uncircumcised? Let him allow himself to be circumcised. So why does Paul have Timothy circumcised? Shouldn't he stay in his uncircumcision? Here, Paul's using circumcision as Jewish and uncircumcision as Gentile. And beginning around the time of the Maccabees, 200 years before Yeshua and the apostles, there's a literal uncircumcision that, according to the book of Jubilees, many Jewish men were having foreskins put back onto their penis. It's a surgery called epispasm, where you put foreskin back onto the penis. In Hellenistic times, even before the birth of Yeshua, Jews encountered the mockery of Greeks who believed uncircumcision to be mutilation, and circumcision at the time was, according to the book of Jubilees, Jewish writing before the time of Yeshua. The book of Jubilees says that circumcision was widely neglected by Jewish people. Many Jews who wanted to participate nude in the Greek games and in the gymnasia and in Roman baths underwent painful operations to obliterate the signs of circumcision. So when Paul says one who is circumcised should not be uncircumcised, he's not just being poetic. He's actually dealing with the real issue. There were Jewish people who were putting foreskin back on their penis to be circumcised, to fit into the Greek world, which is the exact reason why we're circumcised in the first place, to separate us from the nations. So why does Paul have Timothy circumcised? Shouldn't he stay in his uncircumcision? Well, obviously not, because he takes him to be circumcised. Why? Because he's a son of Abraham through his mother. Paul writes to Timothy and actually mentions his mother and his grandmother in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. He says to Timothy, I recall the genuine faithfulness within you, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure is within you as well. So this Jewish family that lives in the Gentile city of Lystra, or Lystra for my mom, his grandmother and his mother were both Jewish followers of Yeshua. And it would make sense that all three generations became followers of Yeshua when Paul and Barnabas came through a year earlier and preached. It's funny, it's like there was such a small Jewish population in Lystra, we have to believe that they all knew each other. It's like people message me all the time or ask me, do you know so-and-so? He's a Messianic rabbi somewhere. And honestly, usually the answer is yes, because there just aren't that many of us. And the same had to be true here. How many Jewish believers, followers of Yeshua, lived in the city of Lystra? And the first place the gospel's preached to the Gentiles in Lystra, to pagan, Greek God-worshiping people not connected to the Jewish people, there's this 3-generation Jewish family that followed Yeshua in Lystra. But Timothy's father is a Greek. He wasn't circumcised because of it. So shouldn't he stay in his uncircumcision? No. Why? Because he's Jewish. Remember, and this is so important, most of the issues with the rabbis in the first century was the legitimacy and authority of the oral law. And it's still the issues that we argue today. Part of the problem with Paul is the oral law was no longer binding in the way that it was before he knew Yeshua. And the question of whether the rulings of the rabbis are binding and obligatory for all Jewish people. And by the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the only remaining group of Judaism is the Pharisees, and they're the fathers of modern Judaism. And everything the rabbis say comes from the first century, historically. But they say it goes all the way back to Moses on Mount Sinai. And man, that's a huge gap. And as Messianic Jews, we don't believe it. That the oral law was not given to Moses and passed down verbally through the rabbis. It also doesn't mean that all tradition is bad. It doesn't mean we reject everything in modern Judaism. I'm wearing a kippah while I speak to you, mostly because I have a bald spot and I want to cover it, but also because tradition's not bad. It only becomes bad when they say that God said you must do what I say. It's not just the rabbis who do that, it's also the church fathers. But while we're on the rabbis, it brings us to matrilineal descent. Many scholars agree that the idea that Judaism has passed through the mother, not the father, was an idea created by the Pharisees in the first century. In the Torah, it's passed through the father, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They all married Gentiles. Of course, in the Encyclopedia Judaica and in other Jewish writings, it says, well, the women are all Jews if you assume, okay, whenever you have to say if you assume, you're going down the wrong rabbit trail. They're not Jewish. And even in the book of Ezra, which is after the Babylonian exile, there's this moment where when they rededicate the temple, they send away all the Gentile wives that are married and that they had children with, the children. But this is quite a specific situation. And people point to it all the time, the story of in Ezra, where they send away all the Jewish wives to say that Jewish people should not marry Gentiles. But there is no commandment in the Torah that says that Jewish people cannot marry Gentiles. There are specific groups which we are not supposed to marry, and all of which no longer exist in this world, that in the time of Ezra, they married those people. And the issue, even in the book of Ezra, is never that they were Gentiles. The issue is that they worshiped other gods. If a Gentile turns to the God of Israel, then we are free to marry them. Conversion, as we've said the last several weeks, is an invention of the first century as well. Everything is an invention of the first century in Judaism. So Timothy, according to the oral law, the rabbis would say, well, he's Jewish no matter what. In fact, they would argue, and still, that whether he's circumcised or not, he's still Jewish through his mother. And they would say, even today, that someone like me, who has a Jewish father and a Gentile mother, is actually not considered Jewish. And they would require me to go through a conversion process, which they invented in the first century. And that's all silly, and it misses the whole point. Remember, we were at a conference, and my older brother also married a Gentile and is also a rabbi, Messianic rabbi in Chicago, and we were at a conference, and somebody said, oh, you both married Gentiles? And my brother said, yeah, we're just living like the patriarchs. So, Acts 16 and verse 3, it says this again. Paul wanted to take Timothy, and so he circumcised him for the sake of the Jewish people in those places, for they all knew his father was a Greek. Paul was following some of their rules, as we follow some of the rules. It's the written Torah that calls for the circumcision of the Jewish people, of Jewish men. Paul believed that because that goes back to Moses and to Abraham. And God commanded us and our descendants to circumcise our children. Everything around how to circumcise and who should do the cutting and what blessings should be said, all those things become optional. They're not bad. They can be good. But what we know, according to the scriptures, is a Jewish person who has one Jewish parent is Jewish, and males who have one Jewish parent should be circumcised. Can you be saved without being circumcised? Of course you can. Stop it. Salvation's not the issue. The issue is obedience. In the first century and today, Timothy would be considered Jewish whether he's circumcised or not because he has a Jewish mother. But this is where the Pharisees and the oral law jump through so many hoops to make points that don't matter. Here's what we know about Paul. He had 2 sons in the faith, and one of them was named Timothy, who is Jewish and who he brought to be circumcised. The other is Titus, who is a Gentile, who he celebrated was not circumcised. Both he considers to be sons in the faith. Scholars and preachers and commentaries and professors, my professor in college, always they cite these words when I make these same arguments and have been making them for the last 25 years of my life. That they say, well, what about Galatians 5 and verse 11? When Paul says, as for me, brothers and sisters, if I still proclaim circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the stumbling block of the cross has been eliminated. So my professor said to me in a response to one of my papers, if Paul is saying, why am I still being accused of preaching, persecuted for preaching the circumcision, which means he wasn't. But whom is he writing to? Gentiles. Where in the Bible does circumcision become a choice or a conviction for Jewish people? Nowhere. Where in the Bible does God command Gentiles to be circumcised? Nowhere. Where in the Bible does God command Jewish people to be circumcised? Well, it starts in Genesis 17, then it goes to Exodus chapter 12, and there's a whole lot of other places. Even Yeshua is circumcised in the Gospel of Luke, which many of you and many people around the world just a few weeks ago read this passage as part of the celebration of Christmas, Luke chapter 2 and verse 21. Just listen to how Jewish these verses are. When 8 days had passed for his Brit Milah, that is his circumcision, he was named Yeshua, not Yeshu. His name means salvation. The name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of their purification were fulfilled, according to the Torah of Moses, they brought him to Jerusalem to present to Adonai. And as it is written in the Torah of God. Funny, it doesn't say the Torah of Moses. God's commandments. Every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. So they offered a sacrifice according to what was said in the Torah of God, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Let's just think about how many times it was said in that short pat in those few verses. Torah, 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 Torah must be that he just circumcised Timothy to appease the Jews. Stop it. Keeping all of the commandments is a part of what makes Yeshua the Messiah. He kept the things that he commanded for his Jewish people to do. And Paul preaches the same thing, not the opposite. Paul being Jewish is a problem for a lot of people, but Paul never argues the written Torah in any of his letters. He argues the legitimacy and authority of the oral Torah. Circumcision is not a requirement for salvation because it was never a requirement for salvation. Circumcision is not even a requirement for entrance into the people of God. It's a sign of the covenant that God made with the physical descendants of Abraham forever. If you dig the movie Sandlot, forever. He commanded Jewish people to circumcise our sons, and he never commanded us to stop. Paul never commanded anyone to stop, Jewish people to stop either. That's the very reason why he brings Timothy to be circumcised. It's also why he does not bring Titus to be circumcised. See, Paul doesn't even call these people the ones he's frustrated with, Judaizers, as many theologians call them today. He calls them agitators. And he says in Galatians 5 and verse 12, I wish they would go the distance in their agitating and would just cut the whole thing off. I wish they would just castrate themselves. Paul didn't hate the Torah. That idea is slander. When we look at the text itself, here in the book of Acts, what you see, as we've talked about through the entire book of Acts, is you first see a Jewish movement among Jewish people. First, Jewish people from all over the world hear the gospel at Shavuot in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. It's not the start of the church. It's the fulfillment of God's promises to the Jewish people. Peter preaches in Hebrew, but all the Jewish people understand them in their own language. Then the gospel's preached to Jewish people who speak Hebrew and Aramaic in Jerusalem. Then the gospel's preached to Jewish people who speak Greek in Jerusalem. Then the gospel is preached to Judea and Samaria, to Jewish people who speak Greek. Then the gospel is preached to God-fearers in Judea who speak Greek. Then the gospel is preached to Jewish people who speak Greek in the city of Antioch. Then the gospel was preached to Jewish people in Cyprus, Phoenicia, and Galatia, who all speak Greek. Then the gospel was preached to Gentiles for the very first time, who speak Greek in the city of Lystra. And 20 years after the resurrection. For 20 years after the resurrection. It takes 20 years for the gospel to be preached to Gentiles. Friends, it's time to do what David Stern, may his memory be a blessing, what he said that we need to restore the Jewishness of the gospel. That we need to restore the Jewishness of the gospel message of Yeshua, Jesus our Messiah, of Paul, and of all the apostles. It's what God is doing in this generation. We can't hide history. We have to understand it, and we have to find out what really happened as we can in these times and these places. It also doesn't mean that Messianic Judaism is always right. God is opening all kinds of opportunities for Messianic Judaism, Messianic Jewish leaders to speak into both the larger Jewish world and the larger Christian world. And look, just like Jewish followers of Yeshua in the 100s, we don't really fit in. Jewish followers of Jesus don't fit anywhere. We don't fit the boxes. We don't fit the categories. We don't fit the narratives of modern Judaism or modern Christianity. We can't be mad or bitter at either side. We can't be mad at the rabbis. We can't be mad at the church fathers. We just have to know who we are. And at Restoration, this is who we are. We are followers of Yeshua, not Yeshu. And among us, there are Jewish followers of Yeshua, and together with Gentile followers of Yeshua, we make up the family of God. Jew and Gentile together. As we often say, because it's one of our core values at Restoration, we deeply believe that everyone belongs in the family of God. We don't all keep the same commandments, but we do our best to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. And that, my friends, may have the biggest impact of all. This short section, 5 verses in Galatians, in the book of Acts, ends with verse 5, and familiar throughout the book of Acts. It says again, so Messiah's communities were strengthened in faith and kept increasing daily in number. So let's, together, those of you who are watching with us from other places in Seattle, let's strengthen our faith and keep increasing in our numbers of all kinds of people who don't feel like we fit anywhere but may have the answer that everybody actually needs, that are turning to God, both Jew and Gentile, in this city of Seattle, and continuing since the days of the Jewish apostles to the ends of the earth. We're a part of something much bigger than ourselves. And we continue to follow the acts of the Jewish apostles. Next week, we're going to pick up in Acts 16 and verse 6. I love you, and I can't wait to see you next time.